Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. For nearly 1,000 years, England and France were not just enemies. They were the gravitational center of European conflict. Kings planned their reigns around the next war across the Channel. Castles were built, armies raised, borders redrawn, always with the other side in mind. War between England and France was not seen as a failure of diplomacy. It was treated as the natural order of the world. And then it vanished. Not with a treaty, not with a grand reconciliation. The rivalry that once defined Europe simply stopped making sense. This is the story of how history's most enduring enemies did not make peace, but became irrelevant to each other as enemies at all. For most of their shared history, England and France were not enemies because of hatred, culture, or ideology. They were enemies because of how power worked. Long before nationalism existed, their rulers were locked inside a system that made conflict almost automatic. After the collapse of Roman authority in Western Europe, power fractured rather than disappeared. Local warlords became kings, and kings ruled not through institutions, but through personal control of land. Authority came from ownership, inheritance, and loyalty, not from borders drawn on a map. Feudalism turned this chaos into a system, but not a stable one. Land was granted in exchange for service, and that service created legal obligations. A noble might hold one castle from one king, and another estate from a different king, owing loyalty to both. In theory, this allowed flexibility. In practice, it created permanent tension. A single dispute could spiral quickly. A disagreement over who controlled a fortified town in Gascony or who owed taxes from a specific port could trigger years of fighting. These wars were not driven by ambition alone. They were driven by legal claims that could not be cleanly resolved. England and France became deeply entangled inside this framework. Their elites married into each other's families. Their nobles held land on both sides of the Channel. Their rulers operated under the same feudal rules. This closeness did not produce stability. It ensured friction. Every shared obligation carried the risk of conflict. Crucially, this rivalry did not depend on memory or emotion to survive. It was renewed constantly by inheritance disputes, disputed titles, and overlapping authority. Even when wars ended, the causes remained intact. Peace was temporary by design. This is why early Anglo-French hostility felt inevitable to those living through it. The system produced conflict the way gravity produces motion. As long as power was organized this way, England and France did not need reasons to fight. The structure supplied them, and that structure was about to become far more dangerous. That danger crystallized in 1066, when William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the Channel and claimed the English throne. His victory did more than change who ruled England. It fused two political roles into one man in a way that feudal law could recognize, but could never fully resolve. As King of England, William was sovereign. No higher authority could command him within his realm. Yet as Duke of Normandy, he remained a vassal of the French king, legally bound to provide loyalty and service. These obligations were not symbolic. They carried real consequences: military support, taxation, and judicial authority. Feudalism treated these roles as separate identities, as though a ruler could switch legal personalities depending on which land he stood in. In practice, that separation collapsed under pressure. When the English king acted independently in Normandy, it looked like rebellion. When the French king asserted authority over Normandy, it looked like foreign interference. Both interpretations were legally defensible, and neither could be ignored. William's successors inherited this contradiction intact. Over the next century, English kings expanded their French holdings through marriage, inheritance, and war. By the reign of the Plantagenets, the English crown controlled vast stretches of western France. On paper, these lands were held in fief. In reality, they gave England power that rivaled the French king himself. This imbalance poisoned the system. French monarchs could not enforce their authority without provoking resistance. English monarchs could not submit without undermining their sovereignty. Even small disputes, control of a single castle, the right to collect taxes from a port, or the obligation to provide troops, could ignite major wars. Conflict became routine. Wars erupted, truces were signed, and the underlying contradiction remained untouched. Each generation inherited not only land and titles, but unfinished disputes. Over time, confrontation ceased to feel temporary. It became an expectation embedded in governance. What began as a dynastic accident hardened into a structural rivalry. England and France were no longer simply entangled by history, they were trapped by it. The feudal framework that had once organized power now guaranteed its breakdown, and as unresolved claims accumulated, the system moved toward a crisis it could no longer contain. That crisis arrived in the early 14th century, when the French monarchy encountered a failure the feudal system could not absorb. A sequence of royal deaths left the French throne without a clear male heir. What had long been a theoretical problem, overlapping claims, suddenly demanded a definitive answer. Edward III of England possessed a legitimate claim to the French crown through his mother. By medieval standards, this was not an outlandish assertion. In a system built on inheritance, blood mattered, but accepting Edward's claim would have meant placing France under an English ruler, dissolving the independence of the French monarchy itself. The French nobility rejected the claim and redefined succession to exclude it. For Edward, this was not simply an insult, it was a threat. If the French crown could alter the rules of succession to deny him the throne, it could also challenge his right to hold land in France. His authority as King of England depended on those lands. Pressing his claim became a way to force the system to confront its own contradictions. Once the claim was made, compromise became impossible. France could not accept an English king without ceasing to exist as a sovereign state. England could not abandon the claim without accepting permanent vulnerability. Feudal arbitration failed. War became the only remaining mechanism. The conflict that followed, the Hundred Years' War, was not a single continuous campaign. It unfolded in waves, separated by truces that merely postponed the next round of fighting. Each generation inherited unfinished objectives and unresolved grievances. Victory in one decade rarely translated into lasting control in the next. Over time, the war transformed political identity. Early English victories demonstrated military superiority but failed to secure stable rule. French resistance gradually shifted from feudal allegiance to loyalty to the crown as an institution. Figures like Joan of Arc symbolized this transition, but the deeper change was structural. France began to defend itself as a unified political entity rather than a collection of fiefs. By the mid-15th century, England's position in France had collapsed. Territory after territory was lost until only a narrow foothold remained. The English crown continued to claim the French title for centuries, but the claim had become ceremonial. The legal and military foundation was gone. The Hundred Years' War did more than exhaust two kingdoms. It severed the structural tie that had bound them together since 1066. England no longer ruled land in France. France no longer faced the prospect of foreign kingship. The feudal contradiction that had sustained centuries of conflict was finally broken. Yet hostility did not end. It changed shape. What followed was rivalry without inheritance. Conflict no longer driven by claims to rule, but by the question of who could shape the world beyond Europe. When the Hundred Years' War ended, something fundamental had changed, but not in the way peace treaties usually change history. England and France were no longer fighting over who had the right to rule each other. That question was settled. What replaced it was something broader, more dangerous, and far more global. By the late 15th century, both kingdoms were consolidating power at home. Kings built stronger tax systems, standing armies, and centralized authority. War was no longer a feudal dispute triggered by inheritance. It was a state decision tied to resources, strategy, and long-term security. England and France emerged from this process as modernizing powers, no longer entangled by law, but still watching each other closely. Their rivalry shifted outward. Instead of contesting a throne, they contested space. A French fort along the St. Lawrence River, a British naval base in the Caribbean, or a trading post in India could now carry the same weight that a duchy in Normandy once had. Control of these places meant control of trade routes, wealth, and influence far beyond Europe. These conflicts were concrete and visual. English and French ships shadowed each other across the Atlantic. Colonial governors fortified ports, expecting attack. In North America, a skirmish over a remote frontier settlement could escalate into a war that stretched across 3 continents. This was no longer dynastic rivalry. It was competition for the shape of the global system itself. Yet even as the scale expanded, the logic remained restrained. Wars were fought, treaties signed, territories exchanged. Defeat hurt, but it was survivable. Neither England nor France sought to erase the other as a state. The rivalry was intense, but still governed by rules both sides understood. This is why the 18th century feels strangely static despite constant warfare. The reasons for fighting had changed, but the rhythm had not. England and France still expected to clash, still planned for it, still recovered from it. The rivalry endured not because it was inevitable, but because it was familiar, and because nothing had yet appeared to make it obsolete. That rupture did not come from overseas competition or European balance of power politics. It came from inside France itself. In 1789, the rules that had governed rivalry for centuries did not merely shift, they collapsed. The French Revolution did not simply replace one government with another. It shattered the assumptions that had kept rivalry between England and France manageable. For the first time, war was no longer a contest between states playing by the same rules. It became a threat to the rules themselves. In 1789, France dismantled its monarchy and rejected the principle that authority flowed from dynastic inheritance. Power was claimed in the name of the nation, enforced by mass mobilization. Armies were no longer limited by feudal obligation or professional recruitment. Entire populations could be conscripted, armed, and directed toward war. For Britain, this was not just instability, it was contagion. The fear in London was concrete. A revolutionary France did not merely threaten borders, it threatened legitimacy. If a king could be overthrown in Paris, the idea of monarchy anywhere could be challenged. British leaders watched as France reorganized its economy for war, seized church lands, and fielded armies on a scale Europe had never seen. This was not a rival to be balanced. It was a system that refused balance. Napoleon Bonaparte emerged from this chaos as both a solution and an escalation. He ended internal disorder while preserving the revolution's capacity for total war. Under his command, France became something unprecedented, a centralized, mobilized state that could overwhelm entire coalitions in months. Capitals fell, borders were redrawn, and old treaties dissolved under the speed of French advance. British strategy narrowed to a single fear: collapse. Not the collapse of Britain itself, but of the European order that allowed Britain to survive. If Napoleon dominated the continent, British naval power would be isolated, its trade strangled, its allies erased. Britain responded by blockading ports, funding armies it did not control, and waging economic war intended to exhaust France rather than defeat it outright. Even so, British leaders drew a critical line. They did not plan to destroy France as a nation. They planned to destroy Napoleon as a force. France, however dangerous, was still a familiar state. Napoleon represented something far worse: a structure killer who made permanent rivalry meaningless by threatening to end the system that rivalry depended on. By 1814, and finally in 1815, that threat was removed. Napoleon was defeated, exiled, and Europe lay exhausted. For Britain, victory created a moment unlike any before it. The greatest enemy in its history was gone, but the question was no longer how to punish France. The question was what would happen if France disappeared from the system altogether. Napoleon's defeat confronted Britain with a decision it had never faced before. For centuries, victory over France had meant a temporary advantage followed by renewed rivalry. Now, France stood beaten, its armies shattered, its ruler removed, and its future uncertain. Britain had the power to determine whether France would remain a major force in Europe or be reduced permanently. The instinct to dismantle a defeated enemy was strong. History offered many examples where broken states were partitioned or weakened beyond recovery. Such outcomes promised security in the short term. But British leaders, shaped by 2 decades of total war, saw a deeper danger. Removing France would not end instability. It would create it. Europe after 1815 was no longer the Europe Britain had known. Russia had expanded dramatically, its armies now accustomed to operating deep into the continent. Prussia had grown stronger, more disciplined, and more ambitious. Austria struggled to hold together a sprawling, fragile empire. In this environment, the disappearance of France would leave a vacuum that other powers would rush to fill. At the Congress of Vienna, Britain acted accordingly. France was constrained but preserved. Its borders were adjusted, reparations imposed, and a monarchy restored. But the state itself remained intact. This was not an act of forgiveness. It was a strategic calculation rooted in fear of what might replace France if it collapsed. By choosing preservation over punishment, Britain quietly abandoned the logic that had sustained centuries of hostility. France was no longer viewed primarily as an enemy to be defeated. It became a stabilizing component of a fragile system. Suspicion remained, but inevitability was gone. This decision did not create friendship. It created a new assumption that Britain's security depended less on weakening France than on preventing any single power from dominating Europe. From this moment on, rivalry with France had to justify itself in a world where other threats loomed larger. The old pattern, defeat, recovery, renewed war, had finally been broken. What followed would not be peace in the traditional sense, but something more durable, a slow reorientation of priorities that made ancient enmity increasingly difficult to sustain. The decades after 1815 did not transform Britain and France into allies overnight. What they produced instead was a quieter, more consequential shift: restraint. For the first time in centuries, both states began planning their futures without assuming that war between them was inevitable. Britain's attention moved east. Russia's expansion toward the Mediterranean and its growing influence over Eastern Europe posed a far greater danger to British trade routes and imperial security than a recovering France ever could. France, diminished but intact, shared this concern. A Europe dominated by Russian power would marginalize both countries, regardless of their past rivalry. This shared anxiety changed behavior before it changed language. Diplomacy became cautious but functional. Crises were managed rather than escalated. Neither side prepared for war with the other as a default assumption. That alone marked a radical departure from centuries of precedent. The Crimean War made this shift visible. Britain and France fought side by side against Russia, not because they trusted one another, but because their interests aligned. Cooperation on the battlefield, shared supply lines, coordinated campaigns, joint command decisions, would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Now it was practical. The significance of this cooperation lay not in victory, but in normalization. Britain and France proved they could fight the same war without fearing betrayal or long-term exploitation. France ceased to be the primary threat around which British strategy revolved. It became one actor among several in a changing system. Industrialization reinforced this transformation. Economic power, population growth, and technological capacity began to outweigh dynastic prestige or territorial inheritance. Britain and France could compete economically and politically without defaulting to military confrontation. Rivalry softened into comparison, and comparison did not require war. By the middle of the 19th century, the logic that had once made Anglo-French hostility feel natural had begun to dissolve. War between them was no longer expected. It was no longer even useful. And as new forces gathered strength in the heart of Europe, the old rivalry started to feel not just outdated, but dangerous to maintain. While Britain and France were learning restraint, the center of gravity in Europe was shifting in a way neither could ignore. Power was no longer flowing through the familiar rivalry across the Channel. It was consolidating in Central Europe, gathering speed and mass, and preparing to overwhelm the older balance entirely. Prussia's rise was methodical rather than dramatic. Through reforms in administration, education, and military organization, it built a state designed for efficiency and rapid mobilization. War became an instrument of planning, not reaction. Victories against Denmark and Austria revealed a new kind of power, disciplined, industrial, and relentlessly modern. For France, this development was alarming. A unified German state threatened to dominate the continent and erase France's role as Europe's central power. For Britain, the danger was different, but no less severe. A continental empire with industrial depth and military reach could challenge the entire European system Britain depended on to protect its trade and empire. The shock came in 1870. Expecting a prolonged conflict, Britain remained neutral as France and Prussia went to war. Instead, the French army collapsed with stunning speed. Within months, Paris was under siege. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the German Empire was proclaimed. a deliberate signal that Europe had entered a new era. This moment functioned like an electric shock to the old system. A single, unified, industrialized Germany now sat at the center of Europe, stronger than any power that had come before it. Unlike France, its strength was expanding. Unlike Russia, its power was concentrated. For Britain, this combination was deeply unsettling. In this new reality, France's weakness became an asset rather than a liability. A recovering France could absorb pressure, slow German dominance, and help preserve balance. British thinking adjusted accordingly, not out of sympathy, but necessity. Supporting France now aligned with Britain's survival. This shift required no reconciliation and no forgetting of the past. It required only recognition of danger. The rivalry that had once defined European politics no longer served its original purpose. A new threat had taken its place, and it demanded a different alignment. Germany's rise forced Britain and France to confront a final, unavoidable conclusion. The European system they had once dominated could no longer survive on old habits, old rivalries, or old assumptions. What was required now was alignment, not because of trust, but because fragmentation invited disaster. Britain hesitated longer than France. For centuries, its security had rested on distance from the continent, enforced by naval supremacy. Entangling alliances were seen as liabilities. France, still recovering from defeat, was politically unstable and militarily cautious. There was no emotional momentum pushing the two together. Only pressure. That pressure came from Germany's behavior. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, the new empire did not simply consolidate its strength, it advertised it. Naval expansion challenged Britain's control of the seas. Diplomatic interventions in North Africa tested French authority and probed British resolve. Each crisis signaled the same message. Germany was willing to disrupt the existing order to secure its place at the top. The Moroccan crises clarified the stakes. Germany expected Britain to remain distant, allowing France to stand alone. Instead, Britain backed France diplomatically. The decision was not sentimental. It reflected a calculation that a Europe shaped by German dominance would be far more dangerous than one stabilized by cooperation with France. In 1904, Britain and France formalized this shift through the Entente Cordiale. It was not a military alliance, and it did not erase suspicion. It resolved colonial disputes and established expectations of consultation. More importantly, it marked the moment Britain stopped planning its future against France. This was the true end of centuries of enmity. No treaty declared it finished. No apology closed the chapter. England and France stopped being enemies because treating each other as enemies no longer made sense in a world reshaped by industrial power and continental empires. The rivalry that had once defined Europe did not end with reconciliation. It ended with replacement. A new threat demanded a new logic, and the old one could not survive it. Once Britain and France accepted that their security depended on coordination rather than competition, the transformation of their relationship became irreversible. What had begun as cautious alignment hardened into habit, reinforced each time a crisis confirmed the same conclusion. Acting together reduced risk, acting apart magnified it. The First World War tested this reality under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Britain and France fought side by side in a conflict that consumed entire societies and demanded unprecedented coordination. Strategy, logistics, finance, and manpower became inseparable. Whatever distrust lingered from earlier centuries could not survive the practical demands of industrial war. More importantly, the war erased the last usefulness of the old rivalry. Industrial conflict required trust, even if limited and pragmatic. Survival depended on shared planning rather than competitive maneuvering. By the time the war ended, Britain and France were no longer merely aligned by interest. They were structurally interdependent. The interwar years exposed disagreements, particularly over how to restrain Germany without triggering another catastrophe. Yet even when policy diverged, the assumption of cooperation remained intact. War between Britain and France no longer existed as a strategic option. It had become unthinkable. The Second World War confirmed this shift permanently. Once again, both states confronted an existential threat that dwarfed all earlier disputes. Occupation, resistance, and total war bound their security calculations together in ways that could not be undone. From that point forward, Rivalry was not simply undesirable, it was meaningless. England and France did not stop being enemies because they reconciled or forgave the past. They stopped because the forces that once made hostility inevitable disappeared. Feudal entanglement collapsed. Dynastic claims lost relevance. Balance of power rivalry was replaced by global systems that neither country could dominate alone. By the time anyone thought to ask when England and France stopped being enemies, the answer was already embedded in history. They stopped when being enemies no longer explained the world they lived in and no longer helped them survive it.